Holding website. All right. They're all going to be put on the Beaker Holding website and on the KMS website. And we're also going to host the recording on these websites. So if you have someone who missed it and would like to hear it, a replay, we will have that recording as well. Just to give a little bit of background, I'm a member of KMS. I feel very passionately about the work that Beaker Cholim does. This organization provides support to patients, to caregivers, older adults in the Jewish community. And it also sponsors regular educational program like this one to help us all improve our health. When we first started planning this program last summer to help us heal emotionally and spiritually from the COVID pandemic, we really didn't know that we'd still be in the throes of it with Omicron. We didn't know we'd be thinking about the emotional well-being of the rabbi and his congregants in Colleyville, Texas, who were held hostage last week in an anti-Semitic attack. But we were thinking about losses, financial losses, job losses, family celebration and simcha losses, but most of all, the losses of our loved ones who died during this pandemic. Many of us in the local community were also mourning the loss of Congressman Jamie Raskin's son, Tommy. We volunteered to deliver food to Holy Cross, and we performed many other mitzvot in Tommy's memory, and in the Jewish tradition, to give his neshama, or his soul, an elevation in heaven. Congressman Raskin is joining us today, and he will be speaking about his experience over the past year. He's been the representative for Maryland's 8th Congressional District since 2017, and he's the author of the new book, Unthinkable: Trauma, Truth, and the Trials of American Democracy. He will have a few minutes at the end of his presentation to take a few questions, and if you have any that you'd like to ask, please put them in the chat and we can ask them for you. And without further ado, we will let Congressman Raskin take over.
Deborah, thank you for that beautiful introduction and for inviting me to be with everyone. I'm just thrilled to be here and delighted that you're putting this event on. I will talk for, I think, pursuant to your instructions, like 8 or 9 minutes, and then I'll be able to answer some questions before I can retreat for a bit and watch before I've got to leave to go catch an airplane. But look, we live in a time of a lot of trauma. 800,000 people have been lost. Well, more than that now. I think nearly 900,000 people have been lost in the COVID-19 crisis. Comparable numbers have been lost in the waves of opioid deaths that we've seen over the last few years. Tommy was swallowed up in his depression and in the mental and emotional health crisis that's overtaken young people. But there are lots of other vectors of danger for our people, including gun violence, where I have a lot of constituents whose families have been touched by that. And then there are the ordinary misfortunes of life that have just been compounded by all of these things: the cancer, leukemia, cystic fibrosis, multiple sclerosis, and on and on. And, you know, I've come to think that everything's been made worse by the coarsening and the degradation of our civil discourse. There's been so much hatred and so much stereotyping, so much anti-Semitism, so much scapegoating injected into our common life that it's extremely difficult for everybody, especially for people who are struggling with a mental health problem. And that was Tommy's situation. I mean, he was a brilliant and dazzling young man. He was a second-year student at Harvard Law School. He was a poet. He was an historian. He was a playwright. He was a comedian. He was a riot in the old-fashioned sense of the term. He was just the life of the party. Everybody loved him, and he was a great friend. He was a great son. He was a great brother. He struggled with depression. And when COVID-19 came and Harvard Law School closed and he came back home, and well, you guys lived through it as I did. I mean, it was a period of great isolation and demoralization for young people, where suddenly everything in their lives, their professional development, their educational development, their relationships, their social lives were radically constricted. And we lost him on the last day of 2020. So uh, I'm not going to be able to tell you everything that happened to me. That's why I wrote my book, because it was a year of a lot of anguish and a lot of grief, a lot of agony for us. It was a sleepless year for me, which is how I wrote my book. I wasn't sleeping, and so I was up through the night. And I did find writing to be an extremely therapeutic, calming thing for me. When I had to read it for the audiobook, that was a wrenching process to relive it that way. But the writing process of it was cathartic, I would say. But we got through this basically through the love of our family, the love of our friends, the love of our neighbors, the love of our community, our congregation, which is Temple Sinai, our rabbi, our cantor. And then because we chose to talk about what had happened, the love of people from really all over the country and all over the world. We heard from thousands and thousands of people. And I decided to write my book, one, because I wanted to honor Tommy and to record everything that had happened, and to make his life vivid and detailed and real as quickly as I could for everybody, so he would never be forgotten. But also because we were deluged with so much love and so much connection with other people who had undergone their own similar traumas and losses. And as a congressman, I've been avid and conscientious about responding to everybody who writes me. And suddenly that became impossible, looking at thousands of these letters, especially because each of them was so emotional. So I decided that I would just write a few standardized generic letters that captured what I was feeling, and then write the book as a way of writing back to people who had sent me such confessional, moving statements about what they had been through. So I came to believe, Deborah, that trauma, well, it's something I think that most people are going to have to wrestle with at some point. I tried to talk to as many moral philosophers, psychologists, psychiatrists, rabbis, priests. I talked to anybody about the nature of trauma and what it means and how to get through it. But I called a friend of mine named Norman Sandridge, who's a professor of classics and political science at Howard. And I asked him whether there was a Greek god of trauma, which there's not. So then I decided to imagine a Greek god of trauma. If there were a god of trauma, what it would look like. And I imagined it with Norman's help, because he's a master of Greek mythology, but kind of like Janus, the Greek god who looks backwards and forwards at the same time, looking both to the past and the future. And the god of trauma strips from you everything that is most precious, most joyful, most important, leaving you completely bereft and destitute and feeling helpless. But if you stick with it, you ride with the god of trauma for a while, suddenly the god of trauma will introduce you to a depth of emotion and feeling and understanding that you never had access to before in your life, and establishes connections between you and other people far deeper and far richer than anything you'd ever known, because you're able to connect to other people's losses and other people's pain, and I imagine a conversation with the god trauma saying, well, I see the two sides of what you have, but it doesn't seem like a fair deal to me, so I think I'd rather not accept it. And the God of trauma says, well, that's the catch. It's not up to you. So it's something that's just presented to you. And you can choose to try to open your heart enough to grow from it if you can, if you can find the means of doing it. But it's just a fact. So I think I told Deborah I don't feel like any kind of expert on any of this. I'm not sure I've got any concrete how-to advice for anybody, but I certainly send my love and my solidarity and strength to everybody who's gone through the multiple traumas of our time, and specifically the losses relating to COVID-19, which have been so wrenching and terrible, and only aggravated by the political chaos and misdirection that surrounded our efforts to save people. So with that, I'm happy to yield back to you, Deborah, and to take a couple questions or just to listen to what people are saying.
Great, and I'll just, we're unmuted, I guess. So if you have any questions, I don't see any in the chat. I have a question, but let me ask one question. I see some people are putting questions in. So Congressman Raskin, I am a writer by profession and love to write, but I'm curious, you did mention that writing was a very therapeutic form for you during this period, and just wondering if you have always been a writer, or if this is something that you just took up as a way to really help to process your grief.
Thank you, Deborah, for that lovely question. But my mom was a writer, Barbara Raskin. She was a journalist and a novelist. And I do talk in my book about how the whole process of using writing in this way reconnected me to her in a really powerful way. When I was a kid, I used to wake up in the middle of the night and I would hear the click clack of her typewriter like through the middle of the night, and hitting the reverse bar and everything. And I'd hear those sounds like they were yesterday. I felt as I was writing the rhythm of her sentences. It's not the first book I wrote. I think it's the fourth book that I wrote. But it's really it's the major book that people are reading that I wrote. I mean, the other are books of constitutional law, so they're of interest primarily to scholars in the field. Although I did write one book for young people called We the Students, which is about the Supreme Court and all of the cases affecting kids. And that's all pretty well. But this is a whole different thing because it's very personal, it's very confessional. And it links the private trauma that we suffered with the public trauma of January 6th and the insurrection, where you probably know my daughter Tabitha was with me, and our son-in-law Hank, who's married to our daughter Hannah, and so that just deepened the traumatic nature of the year, and so it was a struggle to address both of these things, and I have found great relief and solace in fighting for our democracy and defending our democratic institutions, which make the meeting of human needs possible. I mean, we need democracy so we can recognize what people's needs and values and priorities are. I mean, if you're in a dictatorship, you're in an authoritarian society, who cares about the health needs of the public, the emotional health of the public, the mental health of the public? But if it's a democracy, that's a matter of essential priority, really, because we need people at their healthiest physically, emotionally, mentally, in order to govern and to have agency in society.
One of our participants, Richard Dine, asked a question, which I thought was really interesting. He was asking whether you felt that your experience of trauma led to a softening and the coarsening of the politics, or how your opponents were treating you. Like, was it helping in terms of reconciliation on some of these issues?
Yeah, that's a profound question. I wish there were a simple answer. I record in the book the moment when I got up on the House floor on January 6th, because Speaker Pelosi had asked me to lead the responses to the efforts to reject electoral college votes coming in from the states. And, there's an effort to repudiate Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Georgia's electors. So when I got up to speak, I thanked everyone because we had buried Tommy the day before, at the Garden of Remembrance in Montgomery County, and so, I mean, all these things were extremely raw, and I thank people for their expressions of concern and condolences. And then suddenly there was a standing ovation, which shocked me. And I thought for a moment that maybe Tommy's loss would actually change the course of events, that people would not be engaged in this kind of vitriolic, divisive, violent kind of rhetoric. And so I was taken aback, and then I made a speech that was about Lincoln, that was about unity. I invoked Lincoln's statement from his Lyceum address, where he said that if the downfall of America ever came, it would never come from abroad. There was no monster big enough abroad that could ever destroy us. It would have to come from within if doom were to be our destiny. And he was referring actually to racist mob violence. He made that speech in response to a mob takeover of a newspaper and the murder of its editor, Elijah Lovejoy. But he was talking about the dangers of vigilante violence against democratic institutions. But anyway, the reason I tell that story is because I thought maybe it would change some things, but maybe it did for a few people, but it didn't for most of them. And I've got to say, I write about this in my book, but I've always, I'm a middle child, so I like bringing people together. And when I was in Annapolis as a state senator, like a lot of my best friends were Republicans. And, I think the party label is almost like, a race label or an ethnicity label. It shouldn't get in the way of human interaction and relationships. But, we lost our son, and there were people I've been in Congress with for 5 years or 6 years, who I'm like every committee with, like Jim Jordan, who never said a word to me or sent me a note or anything. And then without just letting that go and then launching into attacks on me or on my wife. And that's been tough, I mean, if the people who I clash with the most seriously, like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Lauren Boebert, or, I mean, if they lost someone in their family, I would write them a note because we're colleagues. I just would.
We are running a bit late on time, but I think that Audrey said there was one question that she really wanted to ask. So if Audrey, if you can have one more question, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, I'm just reading on behalf of somebody who put it into the chat. So one person, first of all, they said to make sure to thank you for your vulnerability, opening up today and speaking to us about this very personal matters. And then she asked, do you feel like your course of healing has been different because of COVID or despite of COVID? In other words, how has COVID played a role at all in the grief and healing process?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you, Audrey, and thank you for the question. And thanks to all my friends at Kent Mill, sending love to everybody. It's been too long. I'm sure people will talk about this, but losing someone during COVID-19 is extremely difficult in terms of making plans for burial and funeral and memorial. I mean, we ended up, we could only have family and not even our entire family there because of the, I think it was the 25-person rule that was in place. And so it's difficult to tell, Tommy's girlfriend, his best friends, that they couldn't be there. So we did a memorial service, which ended up being the only place we could find was the parking lot of RFK, and doing it as a drive-in. So that kind of stuff has been a nightmare. On the other hand, I would say that that there's much more attention, I think, being paid to people who've been lost and to survivors just in general, because people understand the emotional intensity and the isolation of these times. And so people have been very good to us, and we certainly have tried to be connected to people who've been experiencing similar kinds of losses. So I do think that there's a certain sort of emotional solidarity and sympathy that's out there, you know, because of it. And you know, in terms of depression and mental illness, I mean, you know, I think some of the stigma is gone, because if a majority of young people are saying they're experiencing depression or anxiety or other psychological symptoms, it's hard for it to be stigmatized when it's most people who are dealing with it, you know. And I don't think that Tommy was remotely alone in terms of what he was suffering. I mean, he was something of an outlier in terms of his empathy, because he felt all of the pain of the world, and was extremely empathic towards not just all people, but all living beings. You know, he was a devout, passionate vegan. And in his farewell note to us, he said, "Please forgive me my illness one today. Look after each other, the animals, and the global poor for me. All my love, Tommy." So those have become like words of instruction to us, sort of a little how-to guide for us to get through it.
Great. Thank you so much, Congressman, for joining us today. I know you have a flight to catch. You have a few minutes you can stick around, but we're going to move along with our program now, and just wanted to express our gratitude to you. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Laura Goldman, for asking that lovely question.
Great. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Lisa Shulman. Dr. Shulman is a professor of neurology at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, and her practice specializes in Parkinson's disease and movement disorders. After experiencing the death of her husband, she wrote a book called Before and After Loss, a neurologist's perspective on loss, grief, and our brain, which is available on Amazon. And I've actually purchased a number of copies and given them to friends. It's really a great book. So without further ado, let's bring on Dr. Shulman.
Well, good morning, everybody. And I really want to personally thank Congressman Raskin for words that were very, very meaningful and really, really help a lot of people that are going through similar things. I'm going to share my screen here so I can show you my slides. Can you see that? Okay, great. So I'll be talking about healing your brain after loss, and it's a perspective of a neurologist. And this is the book that Deborah was just mentioning. Okay, so I'm going to start at the beginning, which is that psychiatry and neurology are the same thing. Most of us don't think of it that way, but the fact is that there are brain mechanisms that underlie all of our feelings and our behavior and our experiences, our emotions. The fact is that, you know, our experience has such texture and richness to it that I think for all of us, it's hard to even imagine that this could be the case, that there are these brain mechanisms we'll be talking about to explain all of this. And I believe that those brain mechanisms are helpful and give us some important clues about healing. Even more amazing, really, is that nature uses this incredible sleight of hand that we're completely unaware of the fact that the brain is doing this. So I want to start by underscoring the fact that loss comes in so many forms. We're just hearing from Jamie Raskin about both the loss of his son and the losses of COVID. And one way to look at that is to go back to this interesting work that Holmes and Rahi did going back 50 years now. And they created this scale, and they did it by asking loads of people the following. They said the life events listed below, this was the instructions, need to be rated in terms of how you view the amount of adjustment you'd need in order to deal with that event. Use a scale with a low of 1 and a high of 100, or any number in between. And you can see the very top of the scale on the right there, because the scale is extremely long. Very interestingly, before I go over some of the things that ended up on the top of the screen, top of the list, the fact is that the whole study was repeated in 1998. And interestingly, very few things changed positions at all. So what we see is that number 1 and number 2 deal with death of close loved ones with mean scores of 87 and 79. And then the number 3 position is major illness or injury to oneself, then to a close family member, then things like divorce, violence, financial reversals, losing one's job, and number 16, surviving a disaster with a mean score of 59. The point being that we have we tend to very strongly in popular culture think about the loss, for example, of a family member as something that's completely different than these other forms of trauma and loss. But what we'll be talking about today is that it's all this spectrum of an emotional trauma. And a spectrum of post-traumatic stress disorder, another example of something we think that is we used to think was a combat-related issue, but is relevant to all of this. So our brain is agnostic to the type of emotional trauma. This is, of course, a cartoon because there are no specialized brain regions to manage the experience of grief, versus a violent assault, versus a serious illness, versus our experiences of COVID. No, the brain has only one mechanism to handle and confront and manage emotional trauma. So, we need to think about both acute and chronic stress, and I'll be talking about that in a moment. One of the most important take-home messages from this talk to remember is that traumatic loss is perceived by our brain as a threat to our survival. I found that when I was going through my own difficulties, really an epiphany in terms of how the whole experience of a serious emotional trauma, once I began to view it through the lens that the brain viewed it as a threat to survival, a lot of things began to fall into place. The brain actually defaults to these protective, evolutionarily conserved survival and defense mechanisms. So on the bottom left there, you see the a little graphic of something we all learned back in school days of the fight or flight mechanism. And when we are confronted by an acute stress, let's say the proverbial bear that you suddenly confront on a hike, the fact is that the primitive centers of the brain that exist partly to surveil the environment for threat and maintain our survival send out a huge warning signal. And this results in a very elegant cascade of hormones and chemical messengers to the brain and the entire body to prepare us to either flee or fight. Immediately, we see increases in our heart rate, our blood pressure, and muscles are mobilized to flee or fight as necessary. On the right side there, you see where we see that there was that perceived threat. There's a heightened alertness for fight or flight. And now in many situations, say that situation of confronting a bear, hopefully the bear runs away and we just return to our baseline homeostasis. But all the types of losses we just looked at on the Holmes and Rahi scale don't behave like that. They do not immediately go away. Quite the opposite. They instead result in a state of chronic stress. That's a very important difference, that we end up living in a world of chronic stress for very long periods. So there are these very pervasive effects of chronic stress, pervasive effects on the mind, the brain, and the body. It affects memory, behavior, sleep, lots of different, and this is all scientifically shown, lots of changes in body function, the immune system, and heart function. A really good example of all this is known as the broken heart syndrome. And that was named, the actual medical name is Takotsubo syndrome. Takotsubo, interestingly, is an octopus trap that's used by Japanese fishermen that you can see on the top right there. So why did the Japanese physicians choose that name of the octopus pot? Well, because the hormones, that cascade of hormones, of stress hormones that are trying to get the body to activate all the time or getting ready to fight or flee, result in abnormal contractions, abnormal contractility of the ventricle of the heart. The ventricle balloons out, appearing like the shape of that octopus pot. The fact is that those changes in contractility can cause very similar symptoms to a heart attack, to angina. And fortunately, in the majority of cases, there's no deleterious consequence and things go back to normal over a period of months. It could even be longer. But in the minority of cases, there actually are people who have a heart attack related to the stress of the broken heart syndrome. So after loss, the brain literally rewires itself. And it does this through a process called neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity is actually a very simple concept. It involves the remodeling of neural connections based on our experience. I mean, right now, all of you we're all together discussing all these topics, and you are experiencing, your brain is remodeling itself because that's part of memory, that's part of experience. And stress is a very potent activator of neuroplasticity. So a really important point on this particular slide and graphic is that there's what I'm going to call good neuroplasticity and bad neuroplasticity. And you can see that in these frames where you see those two cells, those are two brain cells, two neurons. And we can see that brain cells, normally neurons, have lots of interconnections and they have all this arborization to create lots of opportunity for signaling. So in healthy cases, good neuroplasticity, and a healthy situation is low to moderate stress. You have lots of increased nerve growth, increased memory, and that results in decreased fear, which I'll explain later. Whereas under chronic high stress, the unfortunate situation we find ourselves in after serious traumatic loss, we instead see that the neurons, all of those connections are pared down and pruned down. And this therefore a result of high stress is poor nerve growth, reduced memory, and increased fear, as I'll explain momentarily. All this remodeling occurs for even minutes. And most importantly, neuroplasticity continually has the opportunity to move in both directions, either in response to the traumatic loss or in response to thoughtful, restorative experiences. So among the things that has been studied are the consequences of emotional trauma on cognition. And indeed, these weakened neural connections and summoning of all sorts of psychological defense mechanisms. Again, I told you this is perceived by the brain as a threat to survival, as an onslaught, and defense mechanisms such as denial, repression, dissociation are all summoned to protect us and keep us as functional as possible. Now, cognition is not just one thing like memory, it involves many, many different domains, and we can see changes in attention and in speed of information processing due to serious emotional trauma and its consequences. So neurologists have this kind of cool phrase, neurons that fire together, wire together. And what we mean by that is when a circuit fires repeatedly, it's reinforced and becomes a default setting. So you can imagine that if you continuously reinforce bad circuits, bad circuitry that results in anxiety, fear, poor sleep, and so forth, that can become a default setting. If instead you move the needle towards the good neuroplasticity side with more healing and restorative experience, that can substitute and become a default. So in this slide, I want you to sort of think about the brain in two different sections. What you see on the right there, on the bottom, where you see the red arrow, is talking about our primitive brain, also known as the limbic system. So the two sections I'm going to be talking about here are the primitive brain and the advanced brain. The primitive brain has all those different constituent parts you see there, the amygdala, the hippocampus, and so forth. It's the deep-seated part of the brain, and the amygdala is in that yellow oval there. And the amygdala plays the key role in being doing surveillance of the environment all the time for threats. That's one of its major purposes. Whereas the cerebral cortex, which is all the gyrations, the wrinkled part of the brain that we usually think about and is mostly developed in mammals, is our advanced brain, including our reasoning and logic. So imagine a balance between our primitive brain and our advanced brain. We have the amygdala regulating the perception of vulnerability and threat, and the normal state would be a balance, a good balance, a healthy balance between the amygdala and the judgment of the cerebral cortex. However, the unhealthy state is where the loss of balance occurs, and this results in a fear system on overdrive. So one of the leaders in this field who's done tremendous work is Dr. van der Kolk in Massachusetts, and he cleverly calls the amygdala the smoke detector and the cerebral cortex the watchtower. And he talks about this imbalance that I just mentioned, which results in a disconnection between the cognitive and emotional components of our traumatic memories. When we have this imbalance, we're in a state all too often where the amygdala and the primitive brain predominates, and we're in high alert, anxious, and vigilant, and the opportunity for judicious, objective appraisal, analysis, and judgment is reduced because of the imbalance. We can see here in the top left some actual neurons, nerve cells that are dissected out, obviously, from animals. And there are three conditions on the left there, or I should say three regions of the brain: the amygdala on the top, the hippocampus in the middle, and the prefrontal cortex on the bottom. And the animals were either exposed, some were exposed to a severe stress condition, and then we have controls. So what would we expect to see? We would expect to see under the stress condition that the amygdala becoming the default condition is strengthened. And that's exactly what we see there, where the nerve cell from the amygdala is larger and has become predominant compared to the control brain. The hippocampus and prefrontal cortex are both involved in memory. And there we can see that the neurons under the stress condition are atrophied compared to the control condition. So I chose to show this slide because to underscore the fact that we are talking about evolutionarily preserved mechanisms. that we have that are involuntary. We don't have any control over it. When the amygdala sounds the alarm to say that your survival is being threatened, if we were in the crosshairs of the fox here right next to us, we would look very much like the marmot there. The fact is that incredibly, the amygdala responds before our minds are even conscious of the threat. So that it's after a disastrous, say, a near miss with a car, it's only after that we realize, oh my God, I was almost hit by a car. But at the time where we take measures, hopefully to save ourselves, we're just doing things on kind of like automatic pilot. One of the goals of my book and of my work is to talk about grief as a more normal process. Because just as I said that loss is perceived by our brain as a threat to survival, grief, which is only part of all the other stress-related reactions, post-traumatic stress disorder and so forth, is our normal protective processes. This is an evolutionary adaptation to promote our survival when we inevitably in our lives face emotional trauma. And these changes in our brain function tend to go completely undetected because the whole goal of these mechanisms is to preserve daily function. So therefore, it's kind of like almost like a vicious cycle, because the more we do that seems normal, the more we could convince ourselves that we're having no problem. That leader in the field, Dr. van der Kolk, said the most important job of the brain is to ensure our survival even under the most miserable conditions. Everything else is secondary. I love this quote from a really good paper called The Bull in the Evolutionary China Shop. The authors say the misery caused by a hyperfunctional amygdala in PTSD is the cost of inheriting an evolutionary primitive mechanism that considers survival more important than quality of life. So in these final minutes together, I'm going to pivot to talk about how we can reconnect the emotional and cognitive components of memory in order to heal after emotional trauma. So our goal, as I said, is to promote good neuroplasticity. And it's important to recognize the healing properties of many, many things, including contemplative practices. The fact is that I only have time. Let me just, it's a good way to start is to show you this quote from Joan Didion, where she said, "Is it only by dreaming or writing that I could find out what I thought?" And she's, of course, talking about after the loss of her husband. And I'm going to briefly touch on the merits and benefits of dreaming and writing. However, the options for restorative techniques and proactive measures are as individual as we are. Creative practices, being out in nature, exercise, religion, spirituality, it goes on, all the ways in which we can help ourselves. Okay, so with Congressman Raskin, we talked already a bit about writing, and writing has been shown to be very important because it's been shown that it's preferable, more health beneficial to express emotional thoughts when you've been traumatized than to suppress them. And he, in fact, said that he found it very healing to write his book. So there are some really unique benefits of journaling or writing to keep in mind. For one thing, it's the opportunity as you write to not only reflect in the moment on your experience, but also later to come back, reread what you wrote, and be able to annotate, fill in, and reappraise the situation. Another unique benefit is that when you're writing for yourself and no one else. You don't have to censor your thoughts. And as wonderful as it is to speak to a cherished friend or a counselor or a support group, we all involuntarily are going to censor ourselves and be careful of what we say. So when it comes to dreams, dreams are a very potent tool for reconnecting with painful memories that have been suppressed in our subconscious. Sigmund Freud said the interpretation of dreams is the royal road to a knowledge of the unconscious activities of the mind. And when you are traumatized, that's exactly what you want to reconnect with, what has been suppressed in your subconscious. So John Hobson, who's emeritus professor of psychiatry at Harvard, said, why do we need to create an artificial world offline, for goodness sake, and spend 2 hours a day in it? And of course, he's talking about dreams there. So dreams during REM sleep are a vital process for memory consolidation and healing. In fact, almost every analogy of in every book about dreams talks about how we take our memories and then place them in a huge filing system during REM sleep while we're dreaming. So this is what dreams are for, or partly what they're for, very healthy. But highly traumatic memories may be too disturbing to be integrated with past memories. One of the ways one can help themselves during after traumatic losses is to keep a dream journal. Almost everybody, many people say, I can't remember my dreams. Many people say, I don't dream at all. Well, we all dream. It's just that some of us are better at remembering our dreams than others. But the only way to really be able to recall dreams is by keeping a dream journal. So this is like my final slide. And that is to say that we talked about neuroplasticity. And it's so very important to utilize the opportunity to rewire the brain in a healthy way. The purpose of that is, as I said, to reconnect the emotional and cognitive components of memory and move the needle more towards that good neuroplasticity in order to restore balance again between the smoke detector and the watchtower, between the advanced cognitive brain and the primitive emotional brain. So I'll stop there. I want to thank you for the opportunity. And I'm sure that we want to hear from Rabbi Weinberg now.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Shulman. That was an incredibly informative presentation. We really appreciate it. And now I'd like to introduce, who's been waiting very patiently, Rabbi Ram Weinberg. He is much beloved in Kent Mill. He's the rabbi of KMS, Kent Mill Synagogue. He's been the rabbi there for the past 6 years. He also currently serves as the secretary of the Vaad HaRabbanim of Greater Washington. He hails from Montreal, so he speaks French beautifully, I'm sure. He was educated at Yeshiva University for his undergraduate and for his master's degree in Jewish education. And he also earned his rabbinical ordination from Ritz program at Yeshiva University. So without further ado, Rabbi Weinberg.
Thank you so much. Thank you first, Debbie, for organizing this amazing program. I really appreciate being part of it. Appreciate all that you've done to put it together. Of course, thank you very much to Bikur Cholim and to Audrey Siegel in specific for all you do for supporting our community and supporting this program today. I'm really humbled to be speaking alongside our two illustrious panelists, Congressman Raskin and Dr. Shulman. I'm really blown away by each of your presentations and have learned so much from each of you. Very different kinds of presentations, but leaving us a lot to think about. The pandemic has been, as you've all stated, has clearly affected people in countless ways. And we're only beginning to understand the ripple effect of those losses and those traumas. And I was asked this morning to speak specifically about the religious effect of the pandemic, about loss and healing from a religious perspective. And that's a massive topic and undertaking. There's so much to say about that and so many angles from which to view it. I'll speak this morning about one small slice of the picture. I'd like to speak about something that I noticed going back all the way to the beginning of the shutdown in the early months after March 2020. And I'd like to speak about what I noticed and some of the explanations that I found for it, and perhaps how we can grapple with that, just understanding the sense of religious loss during this time of the pandemic. After March 2020, time of the shutdown, people could no longer go to shul, to synagogue for the first time in their lives. I mean, maybe people were in locations that didn't have a synagogue or on vacation, there's no synagogue, but for an extended period of time, to be sort of robbed of that opportunity for the first time in their lives, and truthfully, for the first time in world history. I don't know if there was ever another time where across the planet, every synagogue almost around the world was shut down. There were no minyanim, no communal prayer gatherings in almost any place around the globe. And that vacuum, as you all know, left by the shutdown was very quickly filled, I think, in almost every area that I noticed of synagogue life. In terms of chesed, kindness, good things that we were doing for each other, if anything, that increased after the shutdown. People were shopping for each other, calling each other, checking in on each other. In terms of learning, Torah learning, there was increased amount of shiurim, of classes being given on Zoom in all different kinds of settings, even social gatherings on Zoom, holiday deliveries, connectivity between people. People made a greater effort to stay connected, I think, during that time. The vacuum was filled, I think, in almost every area of synagogue life. But one piece, especially in the Orthodox world, but to some degree in other denominations as well, could not be replicated or replaced, and that was tefillah b'tzibur, communal prayer, one of the central pieces of religious life. Of course, one can pray at home, even if that's not the ideal setting. But what people discovered is that as they prayed at home, they weren't just missing some technical aspects of prayer, like the ability to say Kaddish or other things like that. They weren't just missing out on the fulfillment of one particular aspect of mitzvah, of commandment, of gathering together in prayer with other people. And they weren't just missing focus and kavanah that they might have greater amount of in a synagogue setting, but they realized something more was missing. People started to come to me at the beginning of the pandemic already and throughout, to say that beyond communal prayer, they felt just generally religiously empty. They felt religiously lost. They felt religiously disoriented and unmotivated. People would come to me and say, I'm just not feeling it. I'm just not into it. I'm not feeling connected. I'm not feeling connected to Hashem, to God. People felt something was off, but they couldn't quite explain it or understand it fully. And I think many people still feel it, whether they've returned to synagogue life in some fashion or not, people who are still stuck at home and everything in between. It's not a feeling that quickly dissipates, as Dr. Schulman referenced, in terms of any trauma or loss, those feelings don't dissipate, the effects don't dissipate quickly. But especially in this realm, I don't think it's a feeling that has gone away. It's something people are still feeling and continue to be left with. And although there's much to analyze in terms of this question of why people feel disoriented religiously in this time of pandemic, even though aside from that one aspect of communal prayer, not much has changed religiously, I think there's many ways to understand it. And I want to just make 2 points that I've perceived over the course of this pandemic about why that is the case. Number one, part of the nature of loss in general, I think, is a feeling of disorientation. You're thrown off your game. You feel a little bit lost. You feel a little bit uncertain about the things that you usually take for granted, the basic anchors and moorings of life. When addressing the case of personal loss, the death of a loved one, for example, Rabbi Maurice Lamb, in his wonderful book, Consolation, says the following quote, and I think it's so true. He says, "It's as though we are caught in a long serpentine hallway between 2 well-lit rooms." That's the experience of loss. The reality of the past for people is very clear. If I think of a long serpentine hallway, right? So the reality of the past is very clear. One day, a new reality, you hope, at least in the best case scenario, will be clear. But in the meantime, everything is dark, unclear, windy. He calls it the intermediate, the no place. You're caught in limbo in this long circuitous route between 2 known entities or more known entities. And that is a very bewildering feeling. After loss, a person is naturally alienated from their normal life, from the pre-hallway and post-hallway, as Rabbi Lamb refers to it, leaving them feeling really not just alienated from religion, but alienated from themselves and from Hashem, from God. That's certainly true of what people were feeling as they lost their sense of normalcy in life during the pandemic, and certainly lost the moorings of religious life and shul life. And even if some people have gained aspects of that normalcy back, life is certainly not back to normal. And people, whether they realize it or not, are still in that long serpentine hallway between the two well-lit rooms, the two rooms that are clear and bright. And when you're caught in that in-between, whether you realize it or not, leaves a person feeling disoriented, disconnected, and off, just in a general sense, in terms of all of life, but in this case, in specific, religious life. So that's just one perception in general about the disorienting feeling of loss and that feeling of being caught in between these two well-lit rooms in that serpentine hallway. But the second thing that I've noticed in talking to colleagues and speaking to others and speaking to congregants is that some people were left with more than just a feeling of disorientation. Some people were left with a feeling of being disconnected religiously because their Judaism pre-pandemic was so reliant, perhaps too reliant, upon synagogue life. And it's probably shocking to hear that from a rabbi, but for many people, I think their connection to Judaism, to God, to Torah learning was centered on and dependent upon shul, upon synagogue. Going to shul for many people was the main and most major part, too major a part of their religious efforts, their religious sacrifice, their religious growth, their religious commitment, and their religious life in general. At the start of the pandemic, I realized that pre-pandemic, people's involvement in public religious life was actually masking, in many cases, a deficiency in their personal religious lives. Even if a person's not feeling solid religiously, the feeling of going to shul, to synagogue, of being active in communal religious life gives a person a feeling of being religiously fulfilled, even if underneath they weren't really religiously fulfilled. Shul almost had this placebo effect on people religiously for so many years, making it seem to them that all was well with religious life and growth and their connection to Hashem and to Torah, when maybe it wasn't. Once that public aspect was removed, it revealed something missing on the inside that they had never noticed or focused on before. It wasn't the pandemic that caused them to be religiously depressed or unmotivated or disconnected. It wasn't the loss of going to a minyan, to communal public prayer, that was the cause of that, but rather the loss of that public religious life and involvement simply revealed the deficiencies that they had always had religiously, but had never felt before. In many circles, people pre-pandemic had become too reliant on shul as their main source of religious fulfillment. Shul was meant always to enhance, but not replace, personal religious growth. Just a couple of weeks ago, we read the very first commandments given to the Jewish people in Egypt. One of the main ones that they had to engage with on a personal level was the Paschal lamb, the Pesach sacrifice, the Korban Pesach. If you notice in that section of the Torah, the word bayit, home, is referenced 13 times. It means the whole nature of religious life was supposed to be and meant to be, even in the most nationalistic moment, centered on home. Shul, synagogue, is meant to take the religious life you have personally, that you have in the home, and enhance it. It's not meant to replace it. Shul life is meant to give people a sense of goals religiously, to expose people to religious role models, to give people a sense of inspiration and a lift so they can take that home to their personal lives and work on it and further integrate it. Shul was never meant to replace personal religious growth, but it can easily slip into being that for many people. It gives you a high, it gives you a sense of religious fervor and a feeling of being connected that's wonderful. And I never want to give that up, but it's only step one. You then need to take that home with you. But if you leave it there in the public setting and you have that high, you feel like you're doing your thing religiously, you're succeeding religiously. But since it's not personalized, then it may not be long lasting. And when it's taken away, you realize you don't have enough fortitude religiously on the inside left to really carry you and sustain you. And that is a scary feeling. It's a real blow, not just to one's religious life, but to one's identity. You think of yourself for so long as X, and suddenly the curtain is lifted and you realize you may not be X. it's very, very painful. That's been a real loss for people that I've noticed, not everyone, but for many people, whether they realize it or not, this has been a very real loss for people religiously during the pandemic. And it's almost a loss of a part of their identity. Now, I know we're really out of time, and I really enjoyed listening to their presentations. There's much more to say about these two realizations, the idea of being disoriented, the discovery of being disoriented religiously, and the discovery of the imbalance, perhaps, in the focus on public religious life versus personal religious life that people have discovered throughout the pandemic. But what I will end by saying is that, of course, it's not altogether a bad thing. It may be a very painful thing, painful realization, and a difficult thing to grapple with, but it's certainly not too late. It actually can be a springboard for tremendous growth. And what I would say to all of you on this call is many strategies for how to deal with that and how to grapple with that. And you should all speak to people that you trust and mentors that you trust to try to develop that strategy. But whether you think what I just said applies to you or not, I think what it perhaps can do for all of us, especially during this time of pandemic, is think about the balance of personal and communal in terms of our religious identity and our religious growth, and what we can get from each setting. What's important to us on the personal level and what we should be working on, what's important to us in the communal setting and what we can gain from that and what we can give back to that, whether on an in-person level or even on a virtual level, just to think about those paradigms and what each offers us so that we can get everything we need in a holistic way from our religious life. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Weinberg. You are amazing. And thank you to Dr. Schulman as well for all of your meaningful insights and for sharing. I know we are a little over time, and we do have we are going to be doing a meditation for those who would like to stay, but I would like to just, if we can, and I realize if people have to go, they have to go, but if we could just have about maybe five or 8 minutes for questions, because I think there's so much to unpack here. So Audrey said she had a bunch of questions in the chat, so I think she was going to try to ask.
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Debbie, and thank you, Rabbi Weinberg. That was wonderful. There are a number of questions in the chat, and I apologize for not being able to get to all of them. It's possible that we'll try and address them via email later. So in the meantime, though, there's two that I could highlight. Dr. Schulman, if you could address, for people who don't remember their dreams, somebody asked, how do you have a dream journal if you don't remember your dreams? Is there any way to address that?
Well, thanks for the question, and thanks, Rabbi Weinberg. I enjoyed your presentation. I think what's very important is like some of the things that people teach about how to capture your dreams. And actually, most of us do have a moment when we first open our eyes, or perhaps when we wake up momentarily in the middle of the night, where we have a fleeting thought. And that is exactly what you should write down. You should have paper and pencil near your bedside so that you can write it down at that moment. And sometimes it looks like absolutely like ridiculous, to be honest, totally senseless, but go with it and write it down, because then when you come back and look at it, it might look like maybe a crazy set of jumble of words, but you can look back at it when you wake up in the morning or just a little later, and more oftentimes drifts back to you from the dream. It's sort of like a little hook that now that you can build on. And I would actually suggest that you go back to it over and over in the morning, keep it with you, because you'll find, oh yeah, that, and now I suddenly, and they're all looking like senseless, crazy fragments. And you eventually put together a summary, a little summary of, they may, as I say, look a little peculiar, more than a little peculiar, and you date that, and you do that over a period of time. And what you find is that then you can look at the sequence of those summaries that you've developed, and they begin to start to create a story for you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's really helpful. Another question directed to you, Dr. Schulman, you mentioned how the amygdala and the cortex reacts to all different kinds of stress threats the same way. So what are some tools for differentiating between those so that you're able to respond? If threat presents itself in a very similar way and we have our same response, how can we make those distinctions so that we can respond appropriately to the different levels or different types of grief we're experiencing?
It's I think it's a very complicated question. Obviously, all of this is very contingent on what is the emotionally traumatic stimulus. And when the kinds of examples that I gave, or like the bear on the hike and being almost hit by a car, those are these extremely concrete examples. And they are very different than, say, the COVID experience. In the COVID experience, I think for all of us, it's been unprecedented in our life. Oftentimes it can be something like a headline that we see in the morning with our coffee. We sadly might put on cable news and be terribly alarmed, or we might get a call or text message from a family member saying they just spiked a fever. I mean, any number of those things can cause you to go feel, alarmed. My point is that in that case, we are less aware than we'd be with the bear of the fact that our amygdala had been set into an alarm mode. We'd be less aware. We might just think, oh, I read that article this morning about the variant, but okay, I'll just go to work and hopefully everything we'll get back to that tonight. But no, that's not what happens. And we're unconscious to the fact that a threat has been perceived. We're feeling that entire cascade has been tipped off. And we might somewhere in the middle of the day think, gee, I feel unusually anxious. We might have a bit of a flashback to the headline of the morning, whatever it was. And those are cues. There are all these cues that you are in that state that we were talking about. Now, the part where the coherent cortex and cognitive brain come in is the opportunity to calm that down, because so often our reaction is an exaggerated one, amped up by help, threat to your survival. That's the alarm. And oftentimes it's beyond what the real stimulus is about. That's what we rely on our cognitive brain for.
Thank you. And, towards the beginning of the program, when Jamie Raskin was speaking, there was a question that I'll open up, either Rabbi Weinberg or Dr. Shulman. Really just general question. If you're not famous, if you don't have access to a lot of resources, what's open to you? How can you cope if you're experiencing trauma or grief in this time?
I guess I'll take a stab and then let Dr. Shulman take over. But I think it was mentioned by Dr. Shulman in a very powerful way. But I think speaking things out is perhaps the most basic and important step in any process of healing. And I'll say from the religious perspective, certainly an important component. And you don't have to be famous or have any resources to be able to express that. Like Dr. Shulman said in her presentation, whether it's even just writing it for yourself or journaling it or finding a friend, doesn't have to be an expert or anything like that, or even a rabbi or a teacher, but just to find someone to talk it out with. By expressing it, I think the whole process of Jewish healing and consolation comes to be, because as soon as you start to express it, you start to introspect. As soon as you start to introspect, that opens up a whole world of change of perspective, which is at the core of what nechama, healing, consolation, is really about, and then leads to action of various kinds. Those are steps that all come from the expression of what you're feeling, and I don't think you need any great resources other than someone ready and willing to listen.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think, it's a very, very important question, because, at just the moment when we need to find those resources the very most, we oftentimes are in, like a very disabled condition, not in the best condition to, do a great search for the best resources. Maybe feeling so hopeless and helpless that the obvious of reaching out, say, to speak to the rabbi, to speak to a counselor, even the obvious things, that you feel that it's hopeless. Why even try? Or you can't summon the energy to get out of the house to do it. It's a huge dilemma. The people who need it the most are the ones that are going to be have the hardest time connecting with the resources. I will just end up by saying that, because I give a lot of talks since I've written the book, I've been contacted by, honestly, an avalanche of organizations and websites and podcasts that deal with these topics. And I think to myself, duh, when I needed it, I didn't know any of this existed. It's out there. There's no question. And I know that you said, Audrey, you're going to try to put together a list of resources.
Yes, and that's true. Thank you for that. And we will have a list of resources. I threw a couple of ones in the chat, but more resources on our website. And I believe KMS will also put on the Shul website. And of course, if you have suggestions and you know of either helpful organizations, support groups, please send them my way so we can include those as well.
Yeah, and I want to thank Dr. Shulman and Rabbi Weinberg and Congressman Raskin so much for participating in this program. And I think, one thing that we can all keep in mind is when someone's in grief, they may have trouble accessing these sites. But if you see someone in grief, you can help them provide that lending ear, reach out and say, I know you're grieving right now. What can I do? Or do you want to talk to me? Let's get a coffee. I think that is so important because when we are not in the grief state, we can summon our mental resources and put this together for the person who can't. So I think just a reminder of that as well. And want to thank everyone for coming. And we do have a short meditation, about 10 minutes max for those who want to stay. Sarah Solomon's going to be leading us in that. She is a licensed social worker. She is a member of KMS, and she's been a passionate practitioner of meditation for many years and has found that it's helped her personally as well. And I think that this is just one of those tools that Dr. Shulman talked about in terms of doing positive neuroplasticity on your mind. Meditation is one of those things that you can explore. And this is a nice way to give it a try and see how it goes. So without further ado, we'll bring on Sarah Solomon.
So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm very grateful to be coming after such incredible speakers. And I appreciate so much what Dr. Shulman was saying about how there are kind of as many modalities to work with grief as there are flavors of Baskin Robbins. Everybody is different. But for so many people, meditation is suggested by a friend, by a counselor, by a neighbor, whoever you're behind at the supermarket. But a lot of times the meditation that's recommended is breath focused, which is really important. And we're going to be doing a little bit of that today. But a missing piece to that is a self-compassion focus. And in classical meditation, we're taught that meditation is kind of like two wings of a bird. So there's the anchor focus, which is often breath, but then there's also the compassion or loving kindness focus. So doing one without the other creates sort of an imbalance, which is why I think a lot of people will say, I've tried meditation and my brain is just going everywhere, or I can't focus on my breath. And that's actually really possible. And that's good. It means you're human and your brain is working. But sometimes if we add self-compassion, we can get out of meditation really what we're searching for, which is comfort. So I'm going to invite everyone to find a comfy position. If it feels safe to you, you can close your eyes. You can also just sort of find a comfortable spot on a wall or in front of you to lower your gaze. And I'm going to lead us through a short self-compassion focused meditation. So we're going to start by taking a few deep breaths. We're just going to try to settle our body and just drop into the present moment. So some of us find it helpful to put a hand over our heart, or maybe hug our bellies, whatever you find comforting or soothing. You can also put your hands on your lap. Some people find that grounding. And this is a reminder not just to bring awareness, but to bring loving awareness to our experience and to ourselves. And now feeling your breath move in your body, wherever you notice it the most. For some people, this is the rise and fall of the chest. For others, they might feel coolness or tingling as our breath comes in and out of our nose. Feeling the gentle rhythm of your breathing in and out. And when your attention wanders, as it will, noticing the gentle movement of your breath once again. In and out. And now gently releasing your focus on your breath, or continuing to have a background awareness of your breath as you begin offering yourselves words of kindness and compassion. And I'm going to offer some words to you, but if there's something else that you feel like you need, you can sub them, really just whatever speaks to you. But the traditional phrases that we often use, may I be healthy, may I live with ease, may I be safe. Repeating these words to yourself or listening to my voice as I say these phrases and letting them sort of wash over you. May I be healthy. May I be safe. May I live with ease. Opening your heart and mind to what you need to hear. Words of wisdom and compassion that speak to you in the deepest way. May I be healthy. May I be safe. May I live with ease. Repeating the words over and over, letting them encircle you, surrounding yourself with words of love and compassion. May I be healthy. May I be safe. May I live with ease. If it feels right, absorbing the words, letting them fill your being, allowing the words to resonate in every cell of your body. May I be healthy. May I be safe. May I live with ease. Nothing to do, nowhere to go. Just bathing yourself with kind words, soaking them up. Words that you need to hear. May I be healthy. May I be safe. May I live with ease. And whenever you notice that your mind has wandered, not time to be hard on yourself. This is okay. You can refresh your aim by offering yourself soothing touch, with your hand on your heart or hugging around your middle. Sometimes people like to hold their own hands. Just by noticing the sensations in your body, noticing your breathing as it comes in and out. Coming home to your own body. And then offering yourself kindness with my words or with whichever words speak to you, or even just listening to my voice and letting these words of kindness wash over you. May I be healthy. May I live with ease. May I be safe. Coming home to kindness. Coming home to self-compassion. May I be healthy. May I be safe. May I live with ease. And finally, releasing the phrases and resting quietly in your own body for a few breaths. Feeling your breath move in your body, wherever you notice most easily. Feeling the gentle rhythm of your breathing. And coming back to the sound of my voice and the noises in the room that you're in. And gently opening your eyes.
I'm ready for a nap. That was amazing. Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you everyone who has stayed with us for this program and attended this program. There's going to be a recording of it. So we will put it on the KMS site as well as the Bikur Cholim site. Please share it, and hopefully we can do more of these programs together in the future. Thank you again to Dr. Shulman. Thank you again to Rabbi Weinberg and Audrey Siegel and to Sarah Solomon and Congressman Raskin. I really appreciate it. It was a wonderful program.
And a big
Thank you,
thank you to
everyone.
Debbie Katz.
תודה רבה.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone. Be well.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Bye.